thank the conference organisers for accepting our paper to this stream. My name is Elsa Cameron and I led the ECHO project that explored the experiences of residents and care workers in extra care settings in England. So over the past 20 years, there's been an increasing focus on joined-up services in the UK and internationally. That's why we're here. Currently, this interest is framed as integration, bringing agencies together to deliver a service. And originally in the UK, the focus was very much on how to integrate health and social care agencies. But over the last decade or so, more attention has focused on integrating housing with care. So, for example, the 2014 Care Act in England states that housing is an essential element of local authorities' duty to provide integrated services to people. But it's fair to say that the policy context is precarious in the UK, as I'm sure you're all aware. There are increasing levels of need. Figures suggest at the moment that over 51% of gross local authority spending is on older people aged 65 plus. And current projections indicate that a growing proportion of older people will be living on their own but requiring some sort of support in the future. So extra care housing has been hailed as an integrated model of housing with care that allows older people to live independently whilst also having access to care and support if needed. For those of you unfamiliar with extra care, it is primarily focused on older people who live in self-contained apartments in schemes where there is provision of care, support, domestic, social, community or other services. So most extra care settings have a care team that works 24 hours a day on site. And there are usually communal facilities such as a restaurant, gardens and lounges. Some extra care facilities have other facilities such as IT suites, hobby rooms and gyms. And the idea is that social care and support can be provided to a resident in their own apartment on either a permanent or temporary basis. And that care should be flexible and responsive to the older person's needs. So while we might intuitively believe that integration between health and social care is a good thing, the evidence base that it leads to improved outcomes and cost savings is less than conclusive. Despite the lack of impact evidence, we know that the factors that support joint working and integration include the co-location of services, clear communication, good understanding of and commitment to the aims of the initiative, and a history of joint working. Factors that undermine the success of integrated services include a lack of stability in the policy and organisational context, as well as inadequate funding. And those of you who know a little bit about the English policy context will appreciate that now is a less than ideal context for supporting integrated services. The evidence base for extra care housing is less well developed, but a study undertaken for the Extra Care Charitable Trust suggests that social care costs for those living in extra care are lower than those living in the community, and that average NHS costs are also lower for those in extra care settings. However, a comparative study of extra care with residential and community settings found that residents of extra care were less satisfied with the social care that they received. So the picture, in terms of evidence, is very mixed. So we set about investigating how care is delivered and negotiating in extra care housing schemes. The study was longitudinal in design. We visited 4 settings. We went to each setting 4 times, and we interviewed residents each time we went. We also talked to commissioners, managers, and care workers. And this slide just gives you a little bit of information about our resident sample. So the mean age of our sample was 77 years, but actually 45% of those were over the age of 80. 82% were women, 85% were living on their own, and 42% of the sample received social care at the scheme where they lived. As I've suggested, some residents move into extra care housing with existing care needs, while others move in and only begin receiving care when their situation changes. Now, as this quote demonstrates, resident 2 at Site D was receiving some care every morning, but following a fall just before our study took place, she began receiving additional support on top of that. And she said, I have a shower in the morning, every morning, 7 days a week, and they help me with my medication. And I had a fall last October, and since then, I'm generally accompanied up and down stairs. In other words, someone is with me using the lift because it was at the lift that I fell. I'm fully recovered from that, but that's the sort of care I get, and I'm very happy with it. As I've indicated, care is provided flexibly, so it can be provided on a short-term basis, for example, helping someone to recuperate after a fall. But care might be received for other reasons. So, for example, as this quote demonstrates, a resident who lived and cared for her partner was about to be admitted to hospital. And while she was there, the on-site care team was actually going to provide support to her partner. And on her return, the care team would look after both her and her partner. She said, they'll care for him while I'm at, well, my sister's coming, but I'll get him used to going to the restaurant, you see, and I'll have the housekeepers clean twice a week or once a week as they see fit. And the carers will look after me. They're not nurses, but they can help me shower and wash my hair and that sort of thing. Help me dress if this arm is a bit disabled. But it means I can come home earlier if they needed that sort of care. So although care and support can be provided on site, there's no requirement for extra care settings to provide any health care. Care workers might give residents their medication, but they didn't deliver any care at all. Now, at some settings, the organisation might arrange for district nurses or GPs maybe to run a clinic. But generally, GPs and district nurses only visited residents as they would in the community, if there was a specific need. Like most older people, residents were encouraged to visit their general practitioner, even as if in the first example they were in a lot of pain. Residents didn't always appreciate why this should be the case, as the first quote demonstrates. Because I'm driving, they won't come to me now, the district nurses. I mean, they used to come to treat my leg. I had a bad leg and they used to come. And times when I'd ring to make an appointment, she said, you ought to be going down to the clinic. I said, why? Because she said, you've got a car. I said, granted, I've got a car, but I said, you don't realise the pain and what I go through to get to the clinic. But then what really crowned it was I'm on warfarin, and they check that either weekly or fortnightly, depending on the result. So the implication here is that residents really didn't understand why health wasn't integrated into extra care settings. A consistent theme across the study was a concern that extra care couldn't cope with some of the additional health needs that residents often experienced. And there were 2 elements to this. First, several residents were concerned that having lived in extra care for many years, they would have to move on to another type of residential care setting as their health deteriorated. And this appeared to cause a lot of anxiety to residents. So, for example, the first quote is from a man with MS. He'd moved into extra care for very practical reasons to do with accessibility and accessible care. Living in extra care gave this man a measure of independence he wouldn't have received in more traditional care settings. However, he was really worried that as his condition progressed, he would have to move into a care home where he would have less independence, and that really bothered him. Additionally, across sites, we were told that there were growing numbers of residents who, because they lived with dementia, never took part in the social aspect of the settings. And this was a concern for many residents who felt it undermined the ethos of extra care, which was about providing independence. There was a palpable sense across all of the sites that more residents were moving into extra care with higher and more complex needs than in the past, and that this was putting a strain on extra care, on its central ethos of supporting independence. As this quote demonstrates, there was a sense that settings were struggling to cope with people with more complex needs, and that people were having to move out because they couldn't cope. As this resident describes, I'm just remembering the fact that the lady that we missed, and we didn't know her name, we just knew her by sight, and we started inquiring what had happened to her. Now, she hadn't actually died, she'd been moved on. And this begins to show shortcomings in extra care, if you like. She had to be moved on because she was suffering from dementia, and she couldn't be allowed to go out of the door on her own. But the whole ethic of independence says that she can't be stopped from going out of the door on her own. And we definitely had the impression that there were facilities for every eventuality, that whatever happened to us, we could stay here. In actual fact, it doesn't happen quite like that, does it? So in conclusion, as we've seen, extra care is an alternative to more traditional forms of residential care, where the provision of social care is integrated with housing. The aim is to enable older people to live as independently as possible in their own apartments for longer, providing social care on a flexible basis. The model appears to work for some, but many older people didn't appreciate why healthcare wasn't integrated, and they worry what will happen to them if and when their own health declines. And finally, the study revealed that the wider context, and by that I mean the funding pressures that we're experiencing in England, along with the growing numbers of people with complex needs moving into the schemes, appears to be challenging the idea that extra care housing can be considered a home for life. So thank you.
Actually, Ailsa, that was excellent. I found it very, very interesting. There is a dilemma, two dilemmas actually. Ailsa can only stay for about 2 questions and then has to go for a train. So she's willing to take a couple of questions. But the dilemma about the presentation in terms of the context is, where does extra care housing really sit? Because there's perhaps an ambitious aspiration of an over-promise and yet an under-delivery by virtue of the significant needs that are coming the way of housing providers. Mm-hmm. So I'll open it up for just a couple of questions just now to Ailsa, but Eleanor is here from the university to help answer any other questions at the end if you'd like to ask. So we'd like to see your name and where you're from. Oh, I don't know if there's a mic. Yes, excellent. We are?
Oh, I've got to go in a minute, so I'll just stand.
So my name is Des Mulligan and I work with Integrated Care for Older People in Ireland. Yep. My interest is really around with social care or social housing for older people. there's often a danger that you ghettoise people into, I suppose, separate villages that they may be located alongside an urban hub, but there's absolutely no integration with the local community, and particularly from the point of view of intergenerational integration. So I'd like to know, do you have any examples from the UK where something like that has been addressed?
So from our experience, there are quite a few sorts of initiatives going on in terms of encouraging the community into extra care settings. So maybe offering facilities in extra care settings to be open to the local community. We know of one setting near us that is involving children and running a creche in the community, working with schools. So there is a real awareness of the problem of segregation, but I'd say that the other dimension of this problem is that given the cost of property in the UK, that actually providers are struggling to build extra care facilities in places that would support integration. So they're more and more likely to be built on the outskirts of cities, towns, which is really undermining people's ability to get into the community, but also accentuating that segregation you talk of. So I recognise the problem you're talking about.
That was a lovely question. I could answer that, but I'm not going to take over the stage here. So, anybody else have another question for Ailsa? Anybody else have another question? No? I was just going to say that there may be, with regard to that first question there, in Hanover, what we've done is we've looked at more of we're trying to rebalance, because we've experienced the overwhelming surge, and it's absolutely overwhelmed the staff, and also the balance, the kind of homeostasis, if you call it, of the development isn't right, it's been knocked, and therefore we're looking at a balance of allocation so that you can create more of a community and an internal resilience within that community, as well as provide the extra care to try and get that balance a wee bit better. Experimental, we'll see how it works. But thank you very much, Ailsa, that was super. Thank you, and I hope you can get your train.